Hi, welcome back to the UK Medical Freedom Alliance. I'm Ian Humphreys, and I'm very pleased today to be handing over almost immediately to Dr. Liz Evans. This is a presentation actually she made back in July 2023 for Doctors for Patients, which they've got a fantastic website actually. So if you want to search for that, you should go on there and watch their content because it's very, very good. Very, very informative, and it is real doctors talking about their experiences and the medical profession in general. The presentation she gave was right on the money, and it's really pertinent to what is happening today, and you really should pay attention to it even if you're not a doctor. This is not necessarily for you if you're in the medical profession. No, this is for anybody. Yes, there's some references to doctors, but it is really, as I say, for everyone. Now, you can find all of our content on our website, which is ukmedfreedom.org. That's ukmedfreedom.org. Please go there. You can buy us a coffee, you can make a donation, and you'll be able to sign up for a regular newsletter, which we won't inundate you with, but you'll get as and when we produce them, and all the information will be there that is pertinent to that particular monthly information. I think that's all I need to say right now, so I'm just going to hand you straight over to Dr. Liz Evans.
It's become very apparent over the last 2 or 3 years that we really do have a crisis in medical ethics, not just in the UK, but right around the world. I'm a massive fan of the American founding fathers. I think they have a real wisdom and understanding of human nature and frailties, and the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights that they put together were just outstanding human endeavours to try to create a free and just society. And as Thomas Paine said, the greatest tyrannies are always perpetrated in the name of the noblest causes. And I think we have seen evidence of that over the last 2 or 3 years. So we have seen during the pandemic a dangerous erosion of core ethical principles which underpin a civilized society through the misguided and unethical COVID policies that have been implemented. And I would argue that politics and medicine have been increasingly practiced in an ethical and moral vacuum. And that's led to medical practice becoming more and more dysfunctional and arguably dangerous for patients. So I think now is a really good time for us to take stock and take action to return to core ethical principles in public health. So I'm broadly structured the talk, but to start with an overview of medical ethics, the core principles. Then we'll look at where we are now and what went wrong. Then how did we get here? And then most importantly, and the bit I'd really like your input on when we finished, is how we move forward. I started off as a very conventional doctor until I got into my first SHO job when I actually experienced iatrogenic harm. So I was mid-20s. I had looking back, a completely unnecessary flu vaccine, and it triggered chronic fatigue syndrome. And I was so unwell. I was off work for 2 years, and I knew Western medicine couldn't help me. So I started to do a huge amount of research into alternative nutritional holistic approaches. And little by little, I rebuilt my health, got back to work after 2 years. And it was probably another 2 years before I was fully 100% recovered. So this led to a real paradigm shift. And when I returned to my job, I felt like a square peg in a round hole. But I continued for a couple more years. And then I had time out to have four kids. I'm also, apart from being really passionate about health and medicine, I'm also really passionate about learning. So while I was off looking after my kids, I became a campaigner and speaker on health effects from wireless radiation and smart meters for many years. But then COVID struck in 2020, and I quickly became obsessed with reading all the latest papers and data. I was listening to podcasts. I was looking at stuff all over the world to work out what was going on and to try and understand it. And I think at this stage, I feel like I've done a PhD in all things COVID, which led to me setting up the UK Medical Freedom Alliance in October 2020. And during this process, I realized how little we were actually formally taught ethics at medical school. I think A lot of it you picked up as you went along. I don't know whether it's changed 20 years later, if it's taught differently these days, but I know that I have certainly learned more about medical ethics in the last couple of years than I ever did in my time as a medical student or doctor. And I think through largely self-directed learning, I feel like I'm now a jack of all trades, but a master of none. I'm not formally trained in medical ethics, but I think that my experience as both a doctor, a patient, and a private complementary medicine practitioner looking after patients for nearly 2 decades, and also my Christian faith and my hunger for knowledge and willingness to learn, I think has equipped me to have a voice on this important issue. So COVID policies, even before the vaccines were released, we already had COVID policies around masks and testing, which had challenged established principles of medical ethics, which were that all medical interventions, treatments and vaccines have risks of harm as well as benefits. So they are subject to informed consent and should be voluntary. So when we first set up the UK Medical Freedom Alliance, we were looking at challenging face mask and COVID testing mandates, which we felt went against the rules of informed consent. When I was working out what my part was going to be in trying to challenge what was going on in the pandemic and what I was going to do with my knowledge, why did I get involved in medical ethics? It was very, very early on. By the end of March, I realized there was something very, very wrong. And I just wanted to share this story because it kind of framed how I thought about things for the rest of the pandemic. So we had just gone into lockdown and a friend had gone who was very, very fit and healthy on no medication. You know, it looked like he was 50, but he was actually 70, contracted COVID. And we locked down. He did very well. I was talking to him most days for the first week, but then he took a turn for the worse. His cough was just awful. He was getting weak. He was losing weight. Now, his daughter-in-law was a GP, but no family would visit him. His own GP refused to visit him. So his wife was left caring for him alone at home as he got steadily worse and there was no treatment being offered. And then by about day 12 to 13, he took a turn for the worse. His wife called an ambulance and he was taken to hospital while fully conscious, able to walk. However, within 24 hours, he was ventilated. And for 16 days, he was on the ventilator. His wife was at home alone. The whole country was in lockdown. Nobody could visit her. And she was never allowed to see him again, even when they made the decision to turn off the ventilator. And then even once he died, she wasn't allowed to see his body, not by the hospital, not by the undertakers. So she'd been married to him for 50 years. They'd hardly ever been apart. And she'd had 16 days of hell at home, without her husband. And then she never, ever saw him again. She had a tiny funeral, a handful of people. When he was so popular, he would have had hundreds at his funeral. He was a big community figure. And she grieved largely alone. People wouldn't hug her. So even by the 31st of March, I felt that what is going on? This is barbaric. This is unconscionable. How could we allow this to happen? And I felt really strongly that morally there are certain lines that we cannot cross, no matter what the risk. Even in Ebola, I think, family should be allowed to go and comfort their loved ones. That nobody should be forced to die alone without loved ones present to comfort them, and nobody should be denied access to their nearest and dearest, either in life or death, and that authorities do not have the right to do this to another human being. And even more disturbing, I just could not understand why my medical colleagues were allowing this cruelty. And also, actually, interestingly, why people weren't breaking down the doors of their hospital to be with their loved ones. And I felt that humanity had lost their minds and something very evil was transpiring. And I knew I had to do something and speak out. And I don't make an apology for the use of the word evil. As a Christian, that's how I describe much of what's happened during the pandemic. And I can't find a better way to frame it. So we set up the UK Medical Freedom Alliance in October 2020 and got together a group of medical professionals, scientists and lawyers. And we wanted to focus on informed consent, bodily autonomy, and medical choice. And these are some of the things that we sort of set as our fundamental remit. And over the last 2 years now that we've been established, we've sent over 50 fully referenced evidence-based letters, open letters to pretty much every minister that's made any decisions in government, to regulators, the GMC, decision makers, policy makers, GPs, vaccinators, head teachers, you name it, they've had letters from us, and we've published them all on our website. And we also have produced public information leaflets to educate and empower the public, to help them to make informed decisions. We've drawn up legal template letters to challenge unethical and lawful policies, to help the public if they're faced with a situation such as being refused medical treatment without a mask, or without a PCR test or lateral flow test, or without a vaccine. And then together with the Alliance for Natural Health International, we set up an umbrella organisation called PROMIC, Professionals for Medical Informed Consent. And we've drawn up some really lovely looking vaccine medical exemption forms, which can, there's some that you can sign yourself and tick all the boxes, or ones for doctors to sign, and also some letters to go with it. So these are really useful tools for the public to use to start conversations with their GPs, but also to challenge situations where they're being required to have a vaccine. Looking at the cornerstones of ethical medicine that have been established and practiced for centuries. Now, the reason we need this is that it recognises that there is an imbalance, a fundamental imbalance of power in a doctor-patient relationship. I think the doctor has an incredibly privileged position which comes with a lot of responsibility, because a patient is in a very vulnerable situation. They are having to share intimate details, which maybe they don't even share with their own family. And obviously they are being examined physically by the doctor. And so these ethical principles are aimed to protect the patient from any potential abuse of this imbalance of power. And I think it's important at the start of this to remember that the point of an ethical principle is that you have to hold firm to them in hard times and emergencies, not just when things are easy, because the purpose is to prevent abuse and atrocities from happening, which is, if you think about it, is far more likely to happen in an emergency situation when panic and fear are present. So this practice of medicine, it should occur in the context of what is known as a sacred doctor-patient relationship, which enshrines confidentiality and is patient-centered. And the doctor is under his or her Hippocratic oath to first do no harm, and the principles of bodily autonomy and informed consent apply. So with the patient-centered model of a doctor-patient relationship, this is considered to be the gold standard of ethical medicine. And the primary duty of care of the doctor in this situation is to the individual patient in front of them. So not to their employer, not to the NHS, not to the government or to the wider public, but just focused on the patient in front of them. And the doctor is the patient's advocate and must act in their best interests, taking into account the physical, emotional, and spiritual and philosophical needs and wishes of the patient. Using these principles of first do no harm and informed consent, this will promote trust between the doctor and the patient. So moving on to the Hippocratic Oath, which is recognised as a founding principle of medical ethics around the world, and I'm sure there is not a doctor that has not heard of it. And although it's over 2,000 years old and has been updated and refined, it was designed to give moral guidance and accountability to doctors, and encompassing the phrase "first do no harm, primum non nocere," which is where the benefit of the treatment should outweigh the risk for that individual. And that aim of that is to ensure that all medical treatment is proportionate, necessary, and voluntary. It also embodies confidentiality, which will give trust. And two other things which it said in the Hippocratic Oath is that you must not conduct research without the patient's permission. And also you must pass knowledge to the next generation of doctors. Bodily autonomy is probably not talked about quite so much, but it is the fundamental right of each human being to self-determination over their own body. And it's the foundation on which all other human rights are built. Because if you don't have agency over your own body, you will effectively become a slave or agent of the state or health authorities. So Thomas Jefferson, another founding father, commented on the danger of allowing the state to dictate medical treatment. He said, if people let the government decide which foods they eat and which medicines they take, their bodies will soon be in as sorry a state as are the souls of those who live under tyranny. I love that quote. Informed consent. So this is another key medical ethics and human rights principle. And it's the process by which an individual gives permission before they receive any type of medical treatment, test, or examination. Now, for consent to be legally valid, there's various criteria. So it must be voluntary and it must be informed on the basis of an explanation by a clinician. That clinician must share risks, benefits, and any alternatives to treatment. It's very important that this decision is not influenced by pressure from medical staff, friends, or family, and that the person consenting must have the capacity to make the decision. I think most people have heard of the Nuremberg Code. This was drawn up following the atrocities that were carried out by the medical profession under the orders of the Nazi regime in World War II, including human experimentation and euthanasia. The purpose of the code was to prevent anything like this ever happening again. So relating to medical experimentation on human subjects, it states that the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential, and that the person must exercise free power of choice without any fraud, force, deceit, duress, or any other forms of coercion. Now, the Nuremberg Code is not legally binding in this country, although it is an internationally agreed code of practice. But there are many laws, codes, and declarations which also enshrine informed consent and bodily autonomy, including the EU Charter of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights. There's a UK Supreme Court judgment, Montgomery, which you may have heard of, which overturned the Bolen principle, which was very much a paternalistic view of medicine, where the doctor only had to give the risks that he or she thought were important to share with the patient. Montgomery changed this to patient-centered consent, where the doctor had to share all material risks with the patient, that anything that the patient might consider relevant. It's also enshrined informed consent into the NHS Constitution and the GMC Good Medical Practice, the NMC Code of Practice, and other laws and bills around the world. So we've looked at what we should be doing, what went wrong. So I think the most shocking thing to me is how the medical profession has stood by, largely silent, as under the emergency laws in the UK and to be honest, around the whole world, one by one, fundamental ethical principles have been abandoned and previous hard red lines have been violated. So I've put a few pictures up here. I'm sure you can think of many more, but I'll just give you a few examples. So we have rolled out completely novel technology with no long-term safety data to the whole population, including children and pregnant women, regardless of their risk of COVID or their immune status. Now, to me, that is reckless in the extreme. And there was no regard given to the precautionary principle. And there was an extreme lack of concern over safety. I think a more rational approach would have been to, would have been to aim to only give it to the bare minimum people, the ones who absolutely needed it the most or stood to benefit the most. But we seem to have thrown caution to the winds. There's also been a lot of ethical violations concerning children, using them as human shields. For example, in the jab rollout, the one of the main justifications was to protect granny or to reduce their time off school. We've also force masked them in schools as a condition of their education, despite huge evidence of psychological and physical harms. We've allowed vaccines to be given by non-medically qualified individuals, which I think makes informed consent impossible. How can the person take consent if they are not medically qualified? You've had vaccine mandates passed in order to access basic human rights like work and travel. We had 40,000 care workers sacked who did not want to take the vaccine for whatever reason. We've also had coercive and emotionally manipulative marketing of vaccines to the public, which we've never seen in this country. There's been a massive use of propaganda by government and health officials, which is highly unethical. Another ethical red line, there's been glaring safety signals in the vaccine safety surveillance systems around the world. And yet there's been a total failure of regulators or governments to respond and act on them. And then, as I said at the beginning, we've separated loved ones who are sick and dying. We've forced people to die alone. And we've violated people's medical privacy and confidentiality. You see a picture there of a little child in the middle of a street having something shoved up his or her nose. You've had perfect strangers in shops and trains and hospitals just saying, have you had a COVID vaccine? That is confidential medical information, which nobody has the right to ask you. And it is no surprise that this gross violation of human rights and dignity has led to mass protests all over the world. I think particularly last summer and autumn, there were hundreds of thousands of people on the streets all over the world, UK, US, in the EU, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. So I think it's worth looking at COVID vaccines specifically to see how informed consent has been grossly undermined as we've rolled it out to billions of people. When you take informed consent, you need to share risks and benefits. So I think the risks, both the known risks and the unknown risks, have not been clearly stated or have actively been hidden. The benefits have also been overstated, particularly in relation to young and healthy people, because obviously there's such a massive discrepancy between risk of elderly, sick people from COVID and young and healthy people. So therefore, the benefit from the vaccine will vary by orders of magnitude. And then alongside this, you've had the use of, which I would say is unprecedented, of coercion, blackmail and threats. So the propaganda that I mentioned, there's been a huge use of fear. Social pressure has been applied. There was some interesting bribery going on. People were being given lottery tickets, free lap dances, all sorts of really bizarre things in return for getting a COVID jab. There have been threats to the population. Private corporations have been marketing very heavily, and obviously the mandates were threatened. And in some cases, like Austria, were actually brought in. I've just put together a list of all the things I think for valid, legal, informed consent, every person should have been made aware of and given the opportunity to discuss with a clinician before taking the vaccine and given time to consider them. The vaccines obviously came out under temporary emergency use authorization and actually haven't changed. So we're still using them under temporary use. The phase 3 safety trials are still not complete. When the vaccine rollout started, we only had 2 months of safety data. They use a novel gene-based technology based on mRNA, so they don't work like traditional vaccines. That has not been really highlighted, especially at the point of consent. As I said, there's extremely limited short-term safety data and there is no long-term safety data. However much money you spent on these trials or how many people were involved, you cannot buy the time that's needed to gather long-term safety data, which looks at what the health of these people is going to be like in 5-10 years' time. Are there going to be issues with cancer or fertility or more autoimmune diseases or ADE? All of those things are total unknowns, not least now because they've actually unblinded the trials and vaccinated most of the control group. Then you've got the adverse event reporting data, which has shown absolutely astronomical levels of reports compared to what normally is reported. That has not been shared with people or sort of brought to their attention. We know that there are potential risks. These have been added on as time has gone on. I don't know how many of these are shared with every single person who's giving informed consent. Then you've got the short-lived protection. You know, if people knew that their protection would only last them weeks to possibly months at most, and may even end up in negative efficacy. So after 4 or 5 months, you know, that you're going to be more likely to catch COVID, and that you may need repeated boosters, possibly for life. You know, that changes the picture, or would for some people. Really importantly, that it doesn't prevent infection or transmission, and that was known before the jabs were rolled out. We put it in our first open letter in November 2020. That was very apparent from the trials that was not known, and yet so many people, especially young people, got it only to protect other people because they believed that they would no longer catch or transmit the virus. People did not have discussed with them their individual risk from COVID, so your risk profile is very different, and that makes your decision making very different. Many pre-existing medical conditions were actually excluded from the clinical trials. So there was no testing on those people. So we weren't able to say whether they were safe or effective with those conditions. And then many people, I mean, at this stage have naturally acquired immunity and have no benefit to having a vaccination. The naturally acquired immunity has always been felt to be the gold standard of immunity. So a vaccine can't do better than that. And then alternatives to vaccine, well, we know that COVID treatments have been massively censored, the knowledge of, but there is very good early treatments, which would be an alternative to taking a vaccine if you wanted to have a different approach. And then importantly, that if anything goes wrong, there is no way to sue the manufacturer because they have complete immunity from liability for harms. So on this basis, I doubt that legally valid consent has been obtained for the vast majority of vaccines given. So how did we get here? So these are a few ideas I have as someone working outside the NHS, but I would absolutely love your feedback because whether I'm right on this, I want to know why the medical profession was so ill-equipped to stand up for core fundamental ethical principles and to hold the line for their patients over the last 3 years. So there's about 3 or 4 issues that I think came to my mind. The first is the move from, probably over the last decade or two, patient-centered medicine to protocol-driven medicine, which I read an article by Aaron Kheriaty today. He calls it the difference between Hippocratic and technocratic medicine. So guidelines have kind of morphed to become protocols or algorithms. They're no longer just guiding, they're actually telling doctors what to do. This means that doctors will tend to practice in a much more one-size-fits-all way. This dehumanizes patients, and it also deprofessionalizes and de-skills doctors. And then we have evidence-based medicine, which started off as a great concept, but I think has become increasingly reductionist and highly selective. Probably deliberately, I feel it's been hijacked to only favour pharma-generated evidence. So when I was training, evidence-based medicine was just coming in as a big kind of thing. And the RCT was seen as the gold standard. But I think now we see it as the only evidence that is accepted, which basically really just favours pharmaceutical interventions. So this overemphasis on the science of medicine is problematic because science in itself is amoral and devoid of ethics. It can't inform the practice of medicine alone. You need a human being in the mix. And doctors are those human beings which are required to apply ethical principles and moral values and interpretations to science so that medicine can be practiced humanely. And this is the art of medicine, which brings the humanity into medicine. And we, I think, have lost a lot of this. So this is observation by the clinician, intuition, experience, wisdom, compassion, and also innovation. So, trying different things out, recognizing patterns, and being able to try different things for different patients, even with the same condition. And then public health has grown in power over the last 20 or 30 years. And it really embodies very much a greater good ideology where individual harm is allowed for the good of society. And that overrides the sort of more ethical approach of the sanctity of individual life. And also that leads to basically governments and health officials practicing medicine on individuals, which is not safe and doesn't work. And this is in an environment, a sort of wider environment, where we have big pharma capture of the regulators, scientific journals, academia, and politics. So powerful vested interests are now dictating and controlling medical practice for financial and political gain. There's also these factors which have been thrown in the mix about the lack of legal liability of big pharma. And I thought this was an absolutely chilling quote in August 2020, where an AZ exec said, "This is a unique situation where we as a company simply cannot take the risk if in 4 years the vaccine is showing side effects." This was his reason why they had to have liability protection. And yet the public, are expected to take the risk with their health if in 4 years' time the vaccine shows side effects. They also, we know they negotiated secret contracts with all governments, which nobody seems to be able to actually see. Any documents are heavily redacted. Pfizer, along with the FDA, attempted to block the raw trial data release for 50 years, then for 75 years. It is now being released by court order from a US court. Big Pharma, we know, has a long history of civil and criminal convictions. Their only duty is to their shareholders to increase profits. So we can't look to them to be ethical and practice medical ethics. So we've seen a dehumanization of medicine and the beginning of medical tyranny and medical apartheid being created. And I'm sure you recognize this wonderful, wonderful woman, Vera Sharov, who is a Holocaust survivor and a lifelong public advocate for human rights. She's the founder and president of the Alliance for Human Research. This is, hopefully, if it works, I hope you can hear it, is a clip of her speaking in the recent documentary, The Real Anthony Fauci, about the dangers of doctors following orders.
One of the tragedies that is across the board when it comes to public health. Because you see, when doctors join forces with government, they no longer comply with medicine's mission and sacred oath to first do no harm to the individual patient. They become agents of government and they do what they're told.
I hope you heard that. So I think we need to urgently recognize that we are already on a slippery slope to this medical tyranny that she describes. Here's a couple of examples of really chilling developments in California and Queensland. And actually, I heard this week also in Turkey, they're passing laws or seeking to pass laws to sanction any doctors who deviate in any way from the medical orthodoxy, which is dictated by government in conjunction with the pharmaceutical industry, either publicly or, even more worrying, in private medical consultations with patients. So effectively, second opinions are being outlawed. I think this is extremely dangerous and basically reduces doctors to being agents and mouthpieces of the state. The term scientific consensus is actually meaningless because there should be no consensus in science, because the whole point of the scientific method it involves constant questioning and challenging hypotheses to progress and refine knowledge. And in addition, medicine actually is not an exact science. It's an applied science. So it's not like physics and gravity where you have a rule that applies 100% of the time across the board. we're constantly updating and refining medical science, and the appropriate treatment will be different from one person to the next because individuals differ and one size does not fit all. And it also brings to question who will be the arbiter of truth. Whoever is the arbiter of truth in this situation has immense power, but also immense potential for atrocities to be committed when doctors are not allowed to follow their oath and act in the best interests of their patients. So how can we move forward? This is a few ideas I've had, and I'd love if you have some more to chip in at the end. So I think this is not going to be solved from government or from above. This has to be a grassroots, doctor-driven return to patient-centered medicine. We need to relearn the art of medicine, recognize that science is never settled, and we must be re-engaging with critical thinking where we look at the data direct. We avoid this second-hand opinion where we're told what to think. We just read a journal editorial which tells us, this is the result of this trial, and we don't go and actually look at the research paper ourselves. I wonder how many doctors have actually read through the COVID vaccine trials, for example, and looked at the way, the methodology and the results. We too easily took on second-hand opinions. We must, as a profession, reject cancel culture and embrace debate. Even when we disagree, I think that's, it's good, it's healthy to disagree and have debate. We must call out corruption where we see it. We must have intellectual humility, which means admitting that, when we're wrong, if the facts change, being prepared to change our opinion, and must avoid dogma. We must establish core ethical principles and red lines, which we don't cross no matter what, which hold firm in all situations. We must be our patient's advocate. And I think ultimately we're going to have to move beyond this very narrow pharmaceutical model, which is probably the narrowest that medicine has ever been practiced in over millennia. And we must go back to some natural healing and an understanding of health to empower patients. So one example of a very effective doctor-driven response to reclaim the profession and the Hippocratic Oath was the Global COVID Summit, which was set up in September 2021 by many amazing doctors who we have all heard of, Robert Malone, Geert van den Bosch, Pierre Corey, Peter McCullough, Tess Laurie, Paul Alexander, and many, many more. And they wanted to get doctors together in this way that I'm suggesting to reclaim the profession. So at that point, they got about nearly 13,000 doctors to sign their declaration, which reclaimed and invoked the Hippocratic Oath and its fundamental principles for humane ethical practice. And they put some really powerful phrases in their declaration to uphold and restore the dignity, integrity, art and science of medicine. They recognise the assault on the ability that doctors have to care for our patients, that we're being forced to choose a one-size-fits-all approach, and that we need an individualised and personalised approach to patient care. They raise concerns about physicians being discouraged from engaging in open professional discourse, and prevention, even prevented to treat their patients as their professional judgment felt they should do. And this was a very powerful phrase. This is not medicine. This is not care. These policies may actually constitute crimes against humanity. So they came up with some really good solutions. They felt that the patient must be an active participant, that the political intrusion into the practice of medicine must end, that physicians are free to practice the art and science of medicine and should defend their right to prescribe treatment, but using the tenet first do no harm. And then they put another declaration out specifically on children in November last year, saying that healthy children must not be subject to forced vaccination, recognising natural immunity of people who've recovered from SARS-CoV-2, and that health agencies and institutions shall stop interfering with doctors treating patients. And they then expanded to put out a declaration this year on restoring scientific integrity, where they sort of highlighted this corrupt medical alliance of pharmaceutical, insurance and healthcare institutions and vested financial interests. And that there was an illusion of scientific consensus by substituting truth with propaganda, and the need to restore people's trust in medicine and medical rights and patient autonomy. So the current declarations you can read in detail on their website, but basically calling for an end to the COVID vaccine rollout and the state of emergency, that doctors should be free to treat as they see fit. There should be no more violation of medical privacy, an end of all social and travel restrictions, research into vaccine damage, ban any vaccine mandates, stop medical censorship, and then go further and indict big pharma and enablers for fraud and hold government and health agencies to account. And then we now have our own UK Doctors Declaration, which was launched at the UK Doctors Conference a few weeks ago in London. And this was alongside an open letter to the GMC calling for them to uphold their own good medical practice guidelines. So this declaration you can read at the link here, and you can sign on this link, and basically states that we declare our grave concern about the violation of medical ethics in both clinical practice and scientific research, which we believe can result in serious harm to patients. And that we are fulfilling our duty as outlined by the GMC to take actions when we see that patient safety is being compromised as our concerns relate to potential serious harm to patients. And the 10 points that are in the declaration are these. So do go and read them in detail. It's around honouring fully informed consent, respecting each patient's right to reach autonomous decisions, doctors being at liberty to gather and discuss evidence and information, to ask critical questions, discuss safety concerns, that we stand for the sanctity of the patient-doctor relationship, the ethical principles of good medical practice, transparency, honesty and integrity. We are concerned about compromised integrity within advisory and regulatory bodies, that several of the principles of the GMC good clinical practice have not been upheld. And we're worried also about research findings and how that is being conducted. So do sign up to that. We want to get lots and lots of UK doctors on board with this and share this with your colleagues. So I'm going to give the final word to Benjamin Rush, and he said these prophetic words over 200 years ago. He said, "Unless we put medical freedom into the Constitution, the time will come when medicine will organise into an undercover dictatorship to restrict the art of healing to one class of men and deny equal privileges to others. The Constitution of the Republic should make a special privilege for medical freedoms as well as religious freedom." I think the time has come and we must heed his words before it is too late. Thank you. Thanks for listening.